I would call it soul informed by science. Like at the end of the day, you need to have a gut as a marketer. And I've seen great work test poorly. I've seen terrible work test well. You need to use intuition and trust your intuition as a marketer when it comes to creative, I believe.
Hi, I'm Jason Harris, and you're listening to Soul and Science. Fast forward your marketing mind in about 20 minutes. Hello, welcome to the podcast. Today I'm speaking with Vice President of Marketing at Uber, David Mogensen. At Uber, David oversees a global team of marketers responsible for building and connecting the Uber and Uber Eats brands across more than 70 countries. With more than 20 years of marketing, brand positioning, and advertising experience, David has extraordinary insight into the balance of creativity and strategy in marketing. Before Uber, David held leadership positions at Google, YouTube, and BMW. And he shared some of the valuable insights he's gained from all those different places. In this episode, you'll learn that in marketing, good communication is key, and internal communication is at least as important as external communication. You'll also learn know the user, know the magic, and connect the two. That's a Google mantra, but it works for any brand. In this episode, you'll also learn that good management is ultimately planned obsolescence. Set your team up to work so well that they don't even need you. You'll also learn that Uber leads with soul informed by science. That means initiating an idea, trying it out in a limited pilot, and then testing and refining it. All right, now let's dive right in. All right, we're going to dive right in. Did you fall into marketing, or did marketing find you? Did you know you wanted to do that like when you were in school, or did you fall into it?
No, I definitely fell into it. I did not know what I wanted to be when I grew up for quite a while. I was an economics major in university, and I knew I wasn't going to teach economics or work at the Fed, which are kind of the main two ways that I think most econ majors apply their degree if they wanted to apply it directly. And so for me, when I was finishing university in the end of the late 90s, if you were an economics major, you probably either went into consulting or investment banking. That was where like 90% of my classmates went. And I started interviewing there, and I realized pretty quickly I wasn't really going to enjoy that all that much. And so I decided if I didn't really know what I wanted to do, I should think about where would I want to do it. And so that was really the road I took, which is saying like, well, what am I passionate about? And I was always a really big enthusiast of cars. I still am. I'm a pretty diehard car guy. And so I decided if I don't know what I want to do, let me at least do it somewhere cool. And for me, BMW was the answer to that question. And so I started as an intern at BMW. I was doing distribution, which basically meant helping get the cars to the dealerships. Not the most exciting job in the world, but it was a foot in the door at a great company. And I liked it a lot. They liked me enough to let me interview for other roles. And so I started interviewing for pretty much anything that would come up that I might have some chance at getting. So I was interviewing for HR and finance and marketing. And happily and luckily, I got a job leading event marketing in the US as my first full-time position there. And it was like an epiphany for me. I realized this is what I was meant to do. You know, when you're passionate about a product, marketing is such an awesome role because it allows you to express that passion to a much broader group of people. And so that's kind of how I've always looked at it. And that's what, that's what started it all. And I really haven't turned back since. But I have very little, I'm embarrassed to admit, I have very little formal education in marketing. Most of it has been learned on the job over 20 years of doing it.
First of all, we have a lot in common because I was also an econ major. And I realized pretty quickly I wasn't going to work at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. But I think this first piece of advice is really sound, which is you might not have it all figured out of your career, but you know what companies you're passionate about. So if you start thinking about your passion points and what companies you'd be proud to work for, then you can get into those companies and figure out what skills you can apply and where you might have success. So I think that I've never heard that before. So I think that's actually really insightful. What makes David David? What do you think your sort of strength is, or what makes you unique, do you think, in the world of marketing?
I always throw up a little bit in my mouth when I hear people in marketing talking about storytelling because it's become such a incredible cliche. So I'm going to try hard not to say storytelling, but I will say that I think communications and effective communications is key to this job and this industry. Often we think about the job of marketing from an external standpoint, right? Like what are the campaigns that you've done or what have you? But in my experience in my career so far, internal communications is at least as important to success as external. And so I think the fact that I'm a halfway decent communicator and I have a passion for it has probably been the single thing, if I had to point one superpower that has helped me. And it's been really fun for me. I've gotten to do some cool things as a result.
A lot of communication is simplifying the complex. Were you naturally gifted at that, or did you have to work at that?
Uh, I would love to say I was naturally gifted at it. I had to work at it for sure. I mean, I still remember thinking I was great at it and then having my first university writing course and just getting decimated by the professor. And it was like a wake up call that maybe I'm not quite as good at it as I think I am, and I might need to put a little work into it. It was one of the hardest classes I took in university, but it was also one of the most formative. I guess the other thing I would say is something that I see happen a lot with, especially with younger marketers and folks in business, is this feeling of like, oh, I talk this way, but I should write this way, right? It's like, I talk
Yeah.
like a normal human being, but I should write like a robot. I should write in this incredibly formal and over synthesized way. And as I sort of peeled back from doing that and realized actually good writing sounds like good speaking, you get to a much better outcome.
Simple always wins. And if you can say it in a simple way that's easy to understand, that goes for, internal and external communications. David, I don't know if you know this, but I wrote this book, The Soulful Art of Persuasion. In that book, I do a whole chapter on this idea of persuasion and how simple ideas can endure. And I talked with Martin Puris, who told me the story of how he came up with the line "the ultimate driving machine," which was like 45 years ago at this point.
Yeah.
When you were at BMW, was it easy to keep that consistency in that line? I always wonder when folks are running departments how hard it is to keep what's already been out there for decades.
Yeah. I mean, that one was actually pretty easy because that was like, the holy grail for us. And it wasn't a campaign idea, right? It was the brand promise. And so I think that there's a difference there, right? If you have a campaign that has been working for some time, I think sometimes you get stuck into feeling like creatively, I need to stay within this campaign umbrella, and that can start to limit your creativity. The ultimate driving machine, though, was and is the promise of the brand. And so it didn't really limit us from a creative standpoint. And interestingly, it's not actually the global tagline. Sheer driving pleasure is the tagline in many parts of the world, which I always found really interesting because the ultimate driving machine is so iconic in the US, but it's not actually globally consistent.
After your BMW experience at different places, are you trying to find that iconic umbrella line? Do you think it matters? Or for some companies, that's not critical?
I think that consistency can really help. I guess that would be the way I think about it is, if you're going from campaign to campaign, idea to idea, and each time you're reinventing the wheel, it takes longer to build that salience and that recognition that something iconic like Just Do It or Ultimate Driving Machine can have. And so I do think having consistency is helpful. But I'm not necessarily striving for the perfect tagline. And I don't even know that all brands really need a tagline. I think it's more around figuring out what is the essence of the brand and how do you drive that consistency in a way that will resonate and build the salience that is so important in, a competitive environment.
Moving on to Uber, one of my favorite Super Bowl spots was the ad that Uber did. I thought it was fun. I thought it was clever. It was a great use of celebrities, but it moved along. The celebrities had a purpose. I really had a lot of accolades for it. And what was the process of getting that ad made? in an organization like Uber, I'm sure that's not like an easy feat to pull off and, go through the channels to get approval, et cetera. Like, can you tell me a little bit about that process?
Sure. I mean, first of all, doing a Super Bowl ad, actually, first, thank you. I appreciate the nice remarks. It's definitely, anytime you do a Super Bowl ad, I think it's one of the scariest moments a marketer can have, to be honest with you, because, it's kind of like when you're in school, you get graded on your work, except instead of just getting the report card handed to you from the teacher, it's in every major national publication around the US, all grading your work, right? It is the most public and daunting single ad that I think you can do in a typical year. And so a lot of blood, sweat, and tears goes into putting together a Super Bowl ad. And it definitely, I have a few more gray hairs as a result of it. We knew pretty early we were going to Super Bowl. In terms of the process beyond that, I actually think to get to good work, you kind of need to minimize the number of people that have a seat at the table and are deciding on the work. So we actually have a pretty small team that works on this and has input into it. And then it's just really about, getting to the creative idea that aligns with the brief. For us, it's all about how do we make Uber One, our membership program, famous? And, that was the start of the idea. And what better way to make something famous and memorable than to have a hit song? And so that was kind of the impetus for the idea. And then, once you have the idea, you start to think about creative talent. And for us, it's a bit of a collage that you want to put together where each celebrity that you put in the spot has a role to play, and they're each distinct, and they all kind of play to the rhythm of the spot in different ways. And so it was a mixing and matching game of, okay, what is the talent and what does each one play within it? And then, given that the title of this podcast is Soul and Science, there is a science element to it as well, where we're, doing various qual and quant testing. We're looking at, what is the favorability of different celebrities, and all of that goes into it as well. So there's a bit of science and a bit of soul to putting it all together, and then a lot of hope at the end of the day that it all works out and comes together in a good way, and that people respond positively to it. And we were fortunate that, by and large, the response was very, very positive, and we've seen a nice business impact from it as well.
You have Uber and Uber Eats. Is that challenging to think about both at the same time versus separate, or has that been easier trying to think about them together?
We are increasingly thinking about how do we leverage the fact that we have both sides in our advertising. Last year, we actually did a full kind of creative refresh on our look and feel to bring the two sides a little bit more close together visually. And I think tonality wise as well, they had, prior to me taking the role, I would say they'd been a little bit more separate. And I do think there's a benefit to us connecting the two more and more, especially, if you think about how do you stay top of mind for consumers, which is obviously a key goal for a lot of marketers. If every time you see a Uber Rides ad, it helps you consciously or subconsciously also think about Eats and vice versa, that becomes a advantage for us, a competitive advantage. Because if you think about, especially in the US, we're the only player that has both sides of the business. If we can, find that synergy across the two, that starts to give us efficiencies that our competitors don't have. And I think similarly, there's a great, cross-sell opportunity for us. Hey, you use Uber to get, around town. Like, hey, have you thought about using us for Eats for those that haven't, and vice versa. And we even think about the consumer experience and consumer journey, and, take Uber to the airport, and then once you're at the airport, use Uber Eats to order food, or, take it to the game where you can now, Uber Eats is now delivering in stadiums. So we're definitely thinking a lot about that from a marketing strategy. How do we put the two pieces together where it makes sense?
Do you see a lot of different behavior across the different countries, or do you feel like there's similar behaviors or insights in terms of a marketing perspective? Do you try to take a global viewpoint or more of a local viewpoint?
Yeah, I mean, this is always the debate, right? What can be done globally and what can be done locally, and what's the right approach? So we tend to skew more towards local than global when it comes to creative work. We set the foundation globally. It's a globally consistent look and feel. The brand guidelines, all of that is obviously set, or maybe not obviously, but it is set globally. But then we largely leave it up to our individual countries to think about, okay, how do you bring that to life in your country? And a big part of the reason for that is, especially on the eats side of the business, the delivery side of the business, food is such a local cultural thing. And
Yeah.
food culture in France is very different than in the UK, which is very different than in Japan, which is very different. You get the idea. And so it's important to us that we are locally relevant and culturally relevant. And I think with food, it's crucial that you do that. And so we do take a bit more of a local approach than perhaps other brands. When I was at Google, the Google product experience and the way consumers experience the product is pretty consistent globally. And so it lends itself better to global marketing work as well. But if you think about the difference between like a Google and an Uber, a Google is a digital product that lives in the digital world. Uber is a digital product that lives in the physical world. It's a little bit different than some of the other tech companies. And so I think that translates into the way we approach it from a marketing standpoint as well. And that's part of the reason that we do take this more localized approach to drive that higher level of relevancy.
So you've worked at BMW, Google, like really big brands in different spaces. Is there any learning or commonality between the places you've worked that have, helped you in your career?
There's definitely commonality and there's definitely differences. I mean, I think one of the commonalities across BMW, Google, and Uber is definitely the focus on product, and product being a huge part of how the companies are oriented is towards building the best products, as well as the need to understand the user and starting with the insight and thinking about that from a marketing perspective. Google has this great mantra, which is know the user, know the magic, and connect the two, which I've always really, really liked. It's this idea of sort of understanding the product and really what does the product offer, and understanding the user and what do they need and how will they use that product, and then putting those two things together. And so I think that is I think that's shared across all three. When it comes to differences, I mean, culturally, auto and tech are very different. Like I spent 10 years at BMW wearing a suit and tie every day, and I showed up my first day at Google and, I almost got hit by a guy who was barefoot in shorts riding a scooter in the building, like that was just such a different cultural experience. I think also speed of execution is different across all three. You've got product life cycles of 7 years in the auto industry. Google was much, much faster than that, obviously, but then Uber is like on another level. It's like switching one more gear. Like Uber will develop and release products in a matter of weeks, which I think is shocking to certain marketers in certain industries that are used to these much longer, like I say, product development cycles.
So this is a good point to ask because it is a Soul and Science podcast. Does Uber make business decisions based on gut instinct, like, I think this is going to work in this market? Or is it, we've got to get all the data and research before we roll something out? From a business product standpoint, is it a blend of great idea, let's just go as fast as we can and try it, and then we'll have the data? Or is there a lot of research that happens before products rolled out in, say, a tiny local market?
I think it usually starts with the belief that something will work or could work, and then figuring out, okay, if we think this is going to work, how do we test that and how do we measure that? And if it can't be measured, then that probably is where the decision becomes harder, right? Because how do you test something if you can't measure it? You're not going to know if you succeeded anyway. And so there's probably a high bar, I would say, on making sure it's something you can quantify. But it usually starts with, we think this is a good idea. Until we do it, we can't prove it. And so let's go try it in some sort of limited pilot or something along those lines. And then let's bring data to the equation after we've tried it. But a lot of the ideas, you can't really research them before you do them. You just kind of need to believe in it and do it and then see how it works.
I think that's great. I mean, that seems very exciting. that you can launch all these things and then quickly expand them or kill them based on the results. How do you do that in marketing? Do you test it to death before you roll it out, or do you follow the business practice of like, we'll do a little test of this message, see if it works and resonates, and then we'll put it on a global stage or a country stage? Does it work in a similar fashion for marketing?
Yeah, I would say it does. I mean, I would call it soul informed by science. Like at the end of the day, you need to have a gut as a marketer. And I've seen great work test poorly. I've seen terrible work test well. Like you need to use intuition and trust your intuition as a marketer when it comes to creative, I believe. And so we will start with the idea. We'll work on, we'll start with the brief. We'll start with the strategy. What are we trying to achieve? Then we'll get to what we think is a good idea. And then we do use pre-testing on any of our major campaigns, but it's really more of a refinement tool most often. There have been a couple instances where we'll pretest something and we see that it's just not going to work for what we wanted to accomplish, and then you have to take the decision. Do you believe the pretesting or do you believe your gut and what have you? But there are times where pre-testing will change the course, but usually the pre-testing that we do is more around how do we take what we've got and just amp up certain elements. Like we might use pre-testing to see that brand association isn't strong enough, and so you might change the edit a little bit on a video to bring the brand earlier into the spot or things like that. And then similarly, we measure everything after it runs and while it runs. And if we see that certain things are performing better than others, we'll, adjust the way that we're doing our media strategy. And then after the fact, we'll look at the metrics that we were measuring and we'll learn from those for the next time. But at the end of the day, you have to have some conviction and some faith, and you're not going to be able to test everything and know whether or not work is going to work or not. And so, you have to have that faith in it. So I would say it's soul informed by science.
What is a challenge that you are constantly grappling with at Uber?
Where should we begin? No, I mean, I could answer that a lot of different ways. I think maybe a macro one for me is around, and I think this is probably a common challenge for a lot of marketers, is thinking about short term versus long term. And are you optimizing for selling more poke bowls today, or are we optimizing for what's going to differentiate the brand long term and improve reputation long term? I love I don't quote Steve Jobs a lot because it's very pretentious, but I do love his whole thinking about investing in the brand bank and the fact that you kind of make these deposits, and every once in a while you're probably going to have to make a withdrawal, and you better hope you've built enough in the brand bank. And I think certainly the history of Uber is not without withdrawals, and so making sure that we've built that brand bank is super important. But then how do you balance that with the needs of the business day to day and making sure we're continuing to grow at the aggressive growth rates that we've targeted? And so for me, that's probably the thing that I think about the most is, are we getting that balance right between how we invest in stuff that's going to drive, near term business growth versus longer term brand reputation?
All right. These are some soulful David questions. Do you have role models in your career or in your personal life that, have helped shape who you are today?
Every manager I've had has been someone that has helped shape, I would say, and some not in the intended ways, right? Like you have managers that you learn from because you learn what not to do. I've heard it said before that you actually learn more from bad managers than good. I don't know if that's true, but I certainly have learned from some bad ones. But I've been fortunate in my career to mostly have good ones, and I've sort of taken different things from different ones. With one of my early managers at BMW, I learned how to pair strategy and creativity, in a way that would get to the best result. And sort of the fact that if you had one but not the other, it's not really going to be all that impactful. I learned from another manager about really being choiceful about when you speak in a meeting. She was always a master of saying just the right thing at just the right time, and it had way more impact than the people that would talk the whole meeting.
Man, I got to get better at that.
Yeah.
Oh man.
I think my current manager, has helped me learn that, don't delay making the hard decisions. It often will fester and actually be worse in the end. So I've learned from every one of my managers, and I would say they've been the biggest mentors to me along my career. And hopefully, as a manager myself, I'm able to play a similar role for at least a few folks. I've also learned as I've gotten more and more senior in my roles that there is a danger to speaking first or speaking too much, because most people won't feel comfortable sort of overriding what you say. And so I always try to speak last whenever I can in a meeting, especially when, it's an opinion based discussion, because otherwise you end up influencing the direction of the discussion and you don't always get the best opinions in the room.
Oh man, that is really useful. Do you have a favorite quote or mantra?
I don't know if it's a mantra, but I went through this leadership training a long time ago, and one of the speakers talked about how the best manager is someone that comes in late, reads the newspaper, and goes home. And the reason for that is they've set up the team to work so well that they basically have built in planned obsolescence. They are no longer needed. And that has really resonated with me. I've tried in my career as much as I can to get to a place where they don't need me anymore. And that's when I then go to the next challenge. And so for me, it's this idea of management as planned obsolescence, which I have always really, I've always really liked that idea. And it's something that's kind of guided me along the way so far.
Man, that is a great way to think about it. Is there a goal that you're looking to accomplish? I'd love to hear what's on David's bucket list.
So beyond planned obsolescence and reading the newspaper all day, I would love someday to become a race car driver. And I realize that makes me sound like a 12-year-old boy, but I'm a big car fan, and I had a chance when I was at BMW to do a few driving events and get out on a couple of tracks. And I've always thought it would just be so much fun to be a race car driver. I'm not going to be, the next Max Verstappen, but just at least doing it for fun on the weekends is something that I aspire to do.
Last question. If you had to describe your business style or your philosophy and sum it up in a word, what would that word be?
I hope it would be authentic. I think you'd have to ask people that work with me to see what they say. But I say that because, again, as I've sort of matured in my career and gotten to more senior levels, there's always this tendency of trying to kind of almost play a role and think about, what have I seen other people in this position do, and then try to emulate them. And I think if you are in that position, you should fight that urge. My feeling has been like, whatever got me here apparently has worked, and what's gotten me here is just being myself. And so I've tried to live that in work and in life, where whatever I am outside of work is what I am inside of work, for good or for bad. And so I hope the word is authentic, but hopefully others would say the same thing.
That's where you squeeze the best ideas out, is by being completely letting your guard down and being yourself. Totally. And not trying to go in with your work persona, which closes you off, I think.
I think we need to get rid of work personas.
Yeah.
Eliminate them entirely.
Well, thank you for being on the podcast. I wrote down like 12 things that I learned. Our listeners are going to learn a ton from you. And thanks for being open and really authentic on this podcast and being yourself. We really appreciate it. I think it's going to be a great episode.
Awesome. It's my pleasure. Thanks so much.
Soul and Science is a Mekanism podcast produced by Maggie Bowles, Ryan Tillotson, Tyler Nielsen, Emma Swanson, and Lily Jablonski. The show is edited by Daniel Ferreira with theme music by Kyle Merritt. And I'm your host, Jason Harris.